I left town for 12 days and came back to find that my driveway no longer existed. Not damaged, not blocked, not under construction. Gone. Completely erased, like somebody had opened a map, clicked delete, and decided a piece of my property wasn't worth keeping anymore. The crazy thing is, when I first turned onto my street that afternoon, I didn't even notice it. Everything looked normal. The same quiet neighborhood tucked into the rolling hills outside Asheville, North Carolina. The same old maple trees shading the road. The same ranch houses built back in the 50s when people still cared more about front porches than square footage. It wasn't until I got halfway down the block that something started feeling off. My neighbor's house looked bigger. Not physically bigger at first glance, just more important somehow. Like it had expanded its presence. You know how some buildings seem to dominate a landscape, even when they aren't actually taller? That's what I was looking at. Now my neighbor, let's call him Preston Hale, had only lived there about 4 years. Before that, the place belonged to a retired schoolteacher who grew tomatoes in the backyard and handed out candy on Halloween. Then Preston bought it, and everything changed. Preston was one of those private equity guys who carried himself like every room he entered was a board meeting he already controlled. Nice enough if cameras were around. Different story when they weren't. For years, his property had been under constant renovation. Every few months, another crew showed up. Landscapers, architects, contractors, designers. First came a detached guest house, then a custom pool, then an outdoor kitchen that looked nicer than most actual kitchens. It seemed like every project existed for one reason, to make the previous project look small. So when I saw his place looking larger than usual, I assumed he'd built something else. Maybe another patio, maybe a fountain shaped like his own ego. But then I got closer, and my stomach dropped, because the giant brick courtyard stretching across the front of his estate wasn't just on his property. Part of it was sitting directly where my gravel driveway had always been. I slowed my truck, then stopped, then sat there for maybe 20 seconds trying to convince myself I was misunderstanding what I was seeing. I wasn't. The driveway my family had used for decades was gone beneath thousands of dollars of decorative stonework. Right in the center of it stood Preston, hands folded behind his back, admiring the courtyard like an artist admiring a masterpiece. Beside him was a man in a blazer holding rolled-up plans. They were smiling. I was not. I got out and walked straight toward them. "Preston," I said, "why is my driveway under your patio?" He turned slowly, looked at me, then glanced at the ground as if he genuinely had no idea what I meant. "Oh, that," he said. "The old gravel access." The old gravel access. I remember those words because they instantly raised my blood pressure about 20 points. "You mean my driveway?" I asked. Preston shrugged. "According to the survey we commissioned, it wasn't legally established in the way you think it was." Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile people wear when they think they're explaining something obvious to someone beneath them. There's a shared use designation involved. My attorneys reviewed everything. Attorneys. Of course there were attorneys. "Preston," I said, trying very hard to stay calm. "That's the only route to my garage." He waved a hand dismissively. "You can still drive through here. Honestly, it's probably an improvement. Looks much better than gravel." I don't know if you've ever met someone who mistakes arrogance for confidence, but that's exactly what was standing in front of me. And the worst part was that he genuinely believed he was being reasonable. Standing there in the middle of what used to be my driveway, looking at luxury brickwork covering land my family had used since before he was born, I had a feeling this wasn't going to be a simple disagreement. What I didn't know yet was that Preston had just made the most expensive mistake of his life. And the proof was sitting in a dusty basement box I hadn't opened in nearly 20 years. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those red bricks sitting where my driveway should have been. It wasn't even the inconvenience that bothered me most. It was the assumption behind it. The sheer confidence required for a man to look at someone else's property access and decide, "You know what? I think I'll improve this." Around midnight, I gave up on sleep, grabbed a flashlight, and headed down into my basement. The house had belonged to my grandfather before it belonged to me. My grandfather, Walter Bennett, wasn't just one of the original homeowners in the neighborhood. He'd actually been involved in developing part of the subdivision back in the early 1950s. Growing up, I'd heard stories about survey stakes, grading crews, and planning meetings around the family dinner table. After he passed away, dozens of boxes full of documents ended up in storage downstairs. Most of them hadn't been touched in decades. I started digging. At first it felt like a waste of time. Old newsletters, property tax receipts, black and white photographs of construction crews standing beside houses that looked brand new. There were Christmas cards from neighbors long gone and stacks of yellowed permits nobody had looked at since Eisenhower was president. Around 1 in the morning, I found a metal file box buried behind an old workbench. The label read Community Development Records. That got my attention. I carried it upstairs, spread everything across the dining room table, and started sorting through the contents. That's when I found a folder marked Infrastructure Agreements, 1953. I opened it. The first document was an oversized subdivision map folded into quarters. As I carefully unfolded it, something immediately jumped out at me. Running across several properties was a shaded corridor marked Utility Access Route. I leaned closer, then closer still. My heart started beating faster. The shaded corridor ran directly through my property and continued straight across Preston's front yard. More specifically, it ran directly beneath the exact location of his brand new courtyard. I pulled out additional pages attached to the map. Easement agreements, utility maintenance rights, access provisions, permanent infrastructure protection. The language wasn't vague. It wasn't optional. Utility companies retained unrestricted access rights for maintenance, inspection, repair, replacement, and emergency operations. In plain English, if there was critical infrastructure beneath that land, nobody could legally block access to it. Not with landscaping, not with patios, not with luxury brick courtyards designed by expensive architects. The more I read, the more unbelievable it became. Under that corridor were major service lines feeding a large section of the neighborhood. Water mains, electrical conduits, gas infrastructure, systems that had been there for over half a century. I sat back in my chair and actually laughed. Not because the situation was funny, because suddenly it wasn't hopeless anymore. Then I found something even bigger. Tucked inside another folder was a planning map from the County Fire Authority. At first I almost skipped over it. Then I noticed a highlighted route crossing several lots. My eyes followed the line. It started near the main road, crossed the edge of my property, and continued through the exact path where my driveway had always been. The label stopped me cold. Secondary Emergency Access Route. I read it twice just to make sure. Then a third time. According to the planning notes, when the neighborhood was originally designed, officials worried that emergency vehicles might have difficulty accessing certain homes if the main roadway became blocked. So they designated several secondary routes throughout the subdivision. One of them was my driveway, except it wasn't really my driveway. It was a recognized emergency access corridor that happened to function as my driveway, which meant Preston hadn't simply covered my access path. He had obstructed a documented emergency route. Suddenly his confidence started making a lot more sense. He wasn't evil. He wasn't some criminal mastermind. He was something far more dangerous. He was convinced he already knew everything. Over the years, I'd noticed that pattern with him. Every disagreement ended the same way. Landscapers planted shrubs over my property line. Preston said his contractor handled it. Construction crews blocked neighborhood traffic. Preston said permits had been approved. Workers parked equipment where they weren't supposed to. Preston assured everyone it was under control. There was always another consultant, another attorney, another expert validating whatever he wanted to do. Somewhere along the way, he stopped asking questions because he assumed money had already purchased the answers. The next morning, I started making calls. First was the Regional Utility Authority. I explained that I believed construction had obstructed an active infrastructure corridor. The woman who answered sounded mildly interested at first. Then I emailed copies of the maps. Her tone changed immediately. "Can you send every document you have?" she asked. That sounded promising. Then I called the county fire planning office. I sent them the emergency access map. The man reviewing the documents went silent for several seconds before speaking again. "Where exactly did you say this construction occurred?" I gave him the address. More silence. Then he asked for photographs. Lots of photographs. By lunchtime, I had contacted the city planning department, utility engineers, zoning enforcement, and 2 separate infrastructure offices. Every call ended the same way. More requests for documentation. More requests for pictures. More requests for permits. So I sent everything. By Sunday evening, I had probably emailed 20 different files to half a dozen departments. Then there was nothing left to do except wait. Monday morning, I woke up before sunrise, made coffee, sat beside the front window, and watched Preston's mansion across the street. Around 9 o'clock, the first truck arrived. White utility vehicle. 5 minutes later, another one. Then a city SUV. Then a county truck. By 9:30, there were enough official vehicles parked outside Preston's property to make it look like a disaster response scene. I watched Preston emerge from his front door, wearing loafers, sunglasses, and an expression that suggested he assumed someone was there to admire his renovation. That assumption lasted about 30 seconds. One engineer pointed toward the courtyard. Another unfolded maps. A third began walking across the brickwork, carrying detection equipment. Even from my window, I could see Preston's posture changing. First confusion, then irritation, then concern. One of the utility supervisors knelt near the center of the courtyard and started examining a buried access point. Another employee used a locator device and marked several spots with bright paint. Soon there were colored flags appearing all over Preston's expensive entrance. The courtyard started looking less like a luxury estate feature and more like an archaeological dig. Then the fire marshal arrived. He stepped out carrying a large tube of roll plans. A few minutes later, those plans were spread across the hood of a city vehicle. Several officials gathered around. Fingers pointed. Heads nodded. Preston began gesturing aggressively. At one point, I actually saw him remove his sunglasses and start arguing. Whatever confidence he'd been carrying when he walked outside was disappearing fast. And standing there with my coffee, watching officials slowly uncover a problem buried beneath his masterpiece, I realized something important. The story wasn't about my driveway anymore. The driveway had simply been the thread. Once the city started pulling on it, they were about to discover that the entire sweater might come apart. By early afternoon, the atmosphere outside Preston's house had completely changed. When the inspectors first arrived, he looked like a man hosting an inconvenient meeting. Now he looked like a man realizing the meeting might end with his entire project falling apart. I couldn't hear every word from across the street, but I could hear enough. Every so often a voice would rise above the others. Then someone would point at another section of the property. The inspection kept expanding. That was the part nobody expected, including Preston. What started as questions about a courtyard quickly turned into questions about everything attached to it. One utility engineer located an access panel that had been completely buried beneath decorative stone. Another found service markers hidden underneath landscaping features. Then somebody started reviewing construction permits against the original easement maps. That's when the avalanche began. The detached guest house sat closer to a protected utility corridor than regulations allowed. The underground wine room had been constructed near critical infrastructure access points. Portions of the outdoor entertainment area interfered with maintenance zones that utility crews were legally required to reach. Every new discovery led to another review. Every review led to another concern. Every concern led to another official making notes on a clipboard. If you've never watched confidence slowly drain out of a person, it's a strange thing to witness. Preston kept trying to regain control of the conversation. He pointed to documents. He made phone calls. At one point, I saw him pacing in circles while talking aggressively into his cell phone. I imagine he was calling attorneys, consultants, contractors, maybe anyone who had assured him everything was approved. But the problem wasn't that nobody had looked at the paperwork. The problem was that nobody had looked far enough back. Modern surveys had been reviewed. Recent permits had been reviewed. Yet buried underneath all of that were agreements dating back 70 years, agreements that still carried legal authority. The past had been quietly waiting beneath the ground the entire time. By late afternoon, official notices started appearing. Violation notices, compliance notices, inspection reports, one after another. The phrase that kept appearing was immediate corrective action required. That's government language for you're not keeping this the way it is. Over the next few weeks, reality arrived in the form of demolition crews. The first time I saw workers cutting into that beautiful brick courtyard, I almost felt bad. Almost. Thousands upon thousands of dollars worth of custom stone came out piece by piece. Excavation equipment arrived. Sections of landscaping disappeared. Decorative lighting systems were removed. Retaining features were dismantled. Everything that had looked so permanent suddenly became temporary. That's the funny thing about construction. People think building something is what makes it real. Sometimes all it takes is one inspector and a clipboard to remind you otherwise. As the work continued, the numbers started circulating around the neighborhood. Nobody knew exact figures, but everyone heard estimates. Hundreds of thousands in demolition costs, additional engineering reviews, utility compliance work, permit revisions, reconstruction expenses, legal consultations, delays, more delays. Every week seemed to uncover another problem that needed another solution. The mansion that had once looked like the crown jewel of the neighborhood slowly turned into the most expensive construction zone on the block. Meanwhile, something unexpected happened on my side of the property. Since the emergency access route had to be restored, the city coordinated improvements to ensure future compliance. My old gravel driveway was replaced with reinforced pavement designed to support emergency vehicles if needed. In a strange twist of fate, the driveway Preston tried to erase ended up being better than it had ever been. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive as revenge. Sometimes it arrives as a government-funded paving project. The following summer felt different around the neighborhood. Quieter somehow. Not because people stopped talking about what happened. Quite the opposite. Everyone talked about it. But there was a shared understanding now. A reminder that no matter how much money someone has, there are limits. Infrastructure doesn't care about status. Easements don't care about confidence. Fire codes don't care about ego. About 6 months later, a real estate sign appeared in front of Preston's house. Nobody was surprised. The surprise was how quickly it happened. One day the sign was there. A few months later the property was sold. The luxury cars disappeared shortly afterward. The contractors vanished. The endless renovations stopped. Then one weekend a moving truck arrived. By Sunday evening, Preston Hale was gone. No forward gathering. No grand explanation. No final speech about misunderstood vision and progress. Just a quiet departure. I watched from my porch as the truck pulled away, and honestly, I didn't feel victorious. Not exactly. What I felt was reflective. Because the truth is, none of this had to happen. If Preston had knocked on my door before construction started, we probably could have solved everything over coffee. I could have shown him the old records. We could have checked the maps together. The entire disaster might have been avoided with one simple conversation between neighbors. But arrogance has a way of skipping conversations. It assumes understanding without seeking it. It assumes authority without earning it. And eventually, reality sends the bill. Looking back now, I don't really think this story is about a driveway. The driveway was just the stage where something bigger played out. It was about what happens when ambition turns into entitlement. When success convinces someone they're exempt from the same rules everyone else follows. It's also about something a lot simpler. Communities only work when people remember they're part of one. Property lines matter. Respect matters. Conversations matter. Those things aren't old-fashioned. They're the reason neighborhoods survive long after individual owners come and go. And every now and then, when I pull into my driveway, I think about how close I came to simply accepting what happened. If I hadn't opened those old boxes, if I hadn't asked questions, if I had assumed the expensive lawyers knew everything, the outcome might have been very different. So now I'm curious what you think. If you came home and discovered a neighbor had paved over part of your property, what would your first move be? Would you confront them face to face? Call an attorney? Contact city officials? Or would you start digging through old records the way I did? And here's the bigger question. Was Preston entirely wrong, or was he simply too confident in the experts he hired? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and honestly, that's part of what makes them so fascinating. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who appreciates a little neighborhood drama mixed with a healthy dose of real-world karma. Because sometimes the most unbelievable stories don't happen in courtrooms, corporate offices, or Hollywood movies. Sometimes they happen right next door, underneath a driveway everybody thought was ordinary.